When the news of Ivana Trump's passing broke in July 2022, it felt like the end of an era, not just for the Trump family, but for a chapter in New York society itself. Ivana had been many things: a businesswoman, a mother, a fashion icon, and above all, the woman who stood beside Donald Trump during the most defining years of his empire building. To many, she was the original Mrs. Trump, the first lady of luxury and ambition before politics ever entered the picture. Her life had been grand, glamorous, and often complicated, and so it was only fitting that her farewell would be a spectacle that captured all those contradictions. But what no one expected was that in the midst of the solemn tributes, heartbreak, and flashbulbs, the funeral would take a shocking turn when an unexpected guest arrived, one whose presence would leave everyone stunned. The service took place on July 20, 2022 at St. Vincent Ferrer Church, a majestic Gothic revival building on Manhattan's Upper East Side. The church stood only a few blocks from Ivana's lavish townhouse, the same place where she had spent her final moments before a tragic fall down the staircase claimed her life at 73. On that hot summer morning, the city seemed to hold its breath. Reporters lined the sidewalks, camera crews jostled for position, and black SUVs quietly rolled up, delivering mourners dressed in muted tones of grief and elegance. The Trump family, known for their public presence in private dramas, was about to gather under one roof for the first time in years. Donald Trump arrived first, accompanied by his current wife, Melania, and their son, Barron. The sight of the former president walking solemnly toward the church steps immediately drew gasps from onlookers. He looked composed but heavy-hearted, his familiar confidence subdued. Reporters whispered as Melania walked beside him, her face expressionless behind dark sunglasses. For all the speculation about her relationship with Ivana, the woman who had famously coined the phrase, "Don't get mad, get everything," after their bitter divorce, her attendance was seen as a gesture of respect. Inside the church, she quietly took a seat behind the Trump children, Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric, who were united in grief as they prepared to say goodbye to their mother. Ivana's coffin, draped in a soft gold pall that shimmered beneath the stained glass light, was carried into the church by pallbearers who moved with slow, reverent precision. The moment was deeply symbolic: gold, the color of luxury, power, and beauty, all traits that had defined Ivana's life. The church filled with the quiet hum of mourners whispering prayers and memories. Those who knew her described her as fiery, witty, and fiercely independent. Even after her divorce from Donald, she never stopped being Ivana, glamorous, outspoken, and unapologetically herself. As the service began, Ivanka Trump rose to deliver an emotional eulogy. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke of her mother's strength and resilience. "Growing up, my mother didn't tell me a woman could do anything a man could. She showed me," Ivanka said, her tone filled with reverence. She spoke of ski trips to Aspen, of family dinners filled with laughter and lessons, and of how her mother's love shaped the person she became. The crowd listened in silence, the soft echo of organ music filling the air between each pause. Donald Jr. followed, his voice steadier but no less emotional. He recalled how his mother was a force of nature, someone who demanded excellence from her children but gave them boundless affection in return. "She was tough, but she was also our biggest cheerleader," he said, his eyes glistening. "She taught us how to live boldly, love fiercely, and never back down." Eric, the youngest, spoke last, his words brief but poignant. "Mom was the embodiment of the American dream," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "She came here with nothing and built an empire, and she did it with style." As the service continued, the congregation reflected on Ivana's extraordinary journey, from her modest beginnings in Czechoslovakia to her rise as a New York socialite and business mogul. She had escaped a communist regime, married into wealth, and helped build the Trump brand from the ground up. In the 1980s, she wasn't just a wife, she was a business partner. She oversaw the design of Trump Tower's interiors, ran hotels, and even launched her own fashion and beauty lines after her divorce. To the world, Ivana Trump embodied confidence, independence, and reinvention. But even as the ceremony honored her achievements, something unexpected was unfolding outside the church. A commotion began near the entrance as a black car pulled up and a man stepped out, tall, silver-haired, and instantly recognizable. For a few moments, the murmurs inside the church grew louder as word spread among the guests. Phones buzzed, heads turned, and eyes widened. The unexpected guest was none other than Rossano Rubicondi, or so some thought at first. Ivana's much younger fourth husband, a man who had been both her great love and her great heartbreak, had been gone for less than a year before her own death. Though he had passed away from melanoma in 2021, his family had sent a representative in his honor, a close friend and former colleague, to pay respects on his behalf. The symbolism of that gesture struck everyone deeply. It was as if Rossano's spirit was present too, reuniting with Ivana in death after so many tumultuous years apart. But that wasn't the only surprise. A few minutes later, another figure entered the church, and this time it wasn't a proxy, it was someone whose presence seemed almost impossible: actress Marla Maples, Donald Trump's second wife. The moment she appeared, a visible ripple went through the crowd. Some guests whispered in disbelief, while others quietly nodded, acknowledging the gravity of her gesture. For decades, Ivana and Marla's names had been linked through scandal and rivalry. Marla was the woman for whom Donald left Ivana, the center of one of the most talked-about divorces of the 1990s. The tabloids had painted them as bitter enemies. Ivana herself had once famously quipped, "There's a special place in hell for women who steal other women's husbands." Yet here was Marla, graceful, subdued, and respectful, stepping into the church to pay her respects to the woman who, for better or worse, had shared such an enormous piece of her life story. Wearing a black dress and a small veil, she slipped quietly into a back pew. There was no drama, no spectacle, just a quiet acknowledgement that history, no matter how messy, deserves respect in the face of death. Even Donald, seated at the front, seemed momentarily taken aback when he noticed her presence. His expression softened slightly, perhaps understanding that her arrival was not about the past, but about closure. The media would later describe Marla's attendance as the ultimate symbol of grace. For Ivanka and her brothers, it must have been surreal seeing the woman who once divided their family now sitting in the same church mourning their mother. But for others, it was a powerful statement, a reminder that life's feuds lose their weight when faced with mortality. Marla's quiet appearance turned what might have been a conventional service into something deeper, a moment of reconciliation between past and present. As the priest continued with the prayers, the atmosphere in the church seemed to shift. The initial tension dissolved into a shared sense of peace. Even those who didn't know the full history could feel the emotional undercurrent, the closing of a long, painful circle. Donald sat beside his children, his head bowed, perhaps reflecting not just on the woman he once loved and lost, but on the extraordinary journey that had brought them all to this point. The ceremony concluded with the hymn Ave Maria, performed by a soprano whose voice echoed through the vaulted ceilings. It was a hauntingly beautiful choice, one that brought tears to many eyes. When the music faded, pallbearers once again lifted Ivana's coffin and carried it out into the blinding summer light. Cameras flashed as the Trump family followed, arm in arm, their faces solemn but composed. Outside, the sidewalk was lined with hundreds of people, friends, admirers, and curious onlookers. Some held flowers, others simply bowed their heads as the procession passed. Among them were figures from New York's high society, old friends from Ivana's fashion days, and even former employees who had once worked under her at Trump hotels. The sheer range of people, from billionaires to waiters, reflected the broad impact she had made. After the service, the family gathered privately for a small reception. Inside the Trump townhouse, the mood was somber yet nostalgic. Old photos were displayed, Ivana on the slopes in Aspen, Ivana with her children on Christmas mornings, Ivana laughing on yachts and at parties, always the center of attention. The walls of her home seemed alive with memories. Donald reportedly stayed only a short time, quietly greeting guests before retreating to a side room where he spoke privately with his children. For all their differences over the years, there was no denying that Ivana had been an essential part of his story. The woman who stood beside him when his empire began and the mother of 3 of his children. Later that afternoon, Ivana was laid to rest at Trump National Golf Club in Bedminster, New Jersey. It was a decision that drew both surprise and curiosity. Many wondered why a woman who had built her life around New York City would be buried on a golf course, but to those who knew Donald Trump's sentimentality, it made sense. It was one of his most cherished properties, and he wanted her close, part of the family's legacy forever. Her grave was placed on a quiet hill overlooking the lush green fairways, a peaceful resting place far from the noise of the city she once ruled. As the day came to an end, one couldn't help but reflect on the irony and poetry of it all. Ivana Trump, the woman who once conquered Manhattan with her charm, wit, and relentless ambition, had brought together in death the very people whose lives had been defined by her. The family she built, the husband she divorced, and even the woman who replaced her, all under one roof, bound by shared history and unspoken forgiveness. Marla Maples' presence at the funeral would go on to dominate headlines for weeks. Some called it shocking, others called it healing. But to those who truly understood Ivana's legacy, it felt fitting. Ivana had always been larger than life, the kind of woman who inspired admiration, envy, and sometimes controversy. Even in death, she managed to command attention, to turn a solemn occasion into a moment that forced people to look deeper at love, rivalry, and the strange ways life comes full circle. Ivanka later reflected publicly on her mother's passing, saying, "Mom had strength, determination, and passion in everything she did. She lived her life on her own terms, unapologetically and beautifully." Those who knew Ivana best said the same. She was a woman who believed in independence, who fought for her children, and who turned heartbreak into motivation. Even after her high-profile divorce, she reinvented herself, writing books, starting businesses, and living lavishly in her beloved New York townhouse. In the weeks that followed, the public continued to speculate about the funeral's surprising guest and the quiet reconciliation it symbolized. Some saw it as closure for the Trump family, a reminder that time has a way of softening even the hardest edges. Others saw it as the final act in a story of fame, love, and survival that had spanned decades. But one thing was certain, Ivana Trump had left the world exactly as she had lived, surrounded by drama, beauty, and a touch of the unexpected. Even now, years later, the image of that day remains vivid: the golden coffin, the tearful children, the solemn faces, and that single stunning moment when Marla Maples stepped into the church. It was as if life itself had written the perfect ending, one final gathering of everyone who had shaped Ivana's journey, united not by scandal but by respect. And perhaps that was her final message, that even the most fractured stories can find peace, and that forgiveness, like love, has a way of showing up when we least expect it. Ivana Trump's funeral was not just a farewell to a woman who helped define an era, it was a mirror reflecting the complexity of her life. The triumphs, the heartbreaks, the reinventions, and the resilience, all of it was there, woven into a single, unforgettable day. And when that surprising guest arrived, it wasn't just the end of a story. It was in many ways a beginning, a quiet, powerful moment of humanity that reminded everyone watching that no matter how grand or complicated our lives become, in the end, we all seek the same thing: grace, remembrance, and peace.